The cold morning air bit through Lorenzo's cloak as he stood at the window of his study, watching the sun rise over Florence. The year was 1515, and the city-state trembled under the weight of shifting alliances and foreign invasions. From his vantage point in the Palazzo della Signoria, he could see merchants hurrying through the streets, their faces etched with the anxiety that had become commonplace since the French had swept through Italy like a plague of locusts. Lorenzo had risen from nothing, the son of a blacksmith who had learned to read by candlelight and fought his way into the corridors of power through cunning, patience, and an understanding of human nature that bordered on the supernatural. But, today, as he prepared for the most crucial negotiation of his career, he reflected not on his achievements, but on the three principles that had transformed him from a weak, desperate boy into a man who commanded the respect and fear of princes. The first principle had revealed itself to him during his darkest hour, when he was 23 and facing execution for a crime he did not commit. The second had crystallized during his meteoric rise through the Florentine bureaucracy, when he learned that desire, properly channeled, was the greatest force for transformation known to man. The third had become clear only recently, as he watched lesser men crumble under pressures that left him unshaken, their destinies controlled by forces they refused to understand. Today, these principles would be tested against Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, a man whose political acumen was matched only by his ruthlessness. The cardinal had arrived in Florence with a proposal that could either elevate Lorenzo to unprecedented heights or destroy everything he had built. As Lorenzo adjusted his doublet and prepared to descend to the reception hall, he allowed his mind to wander through the journey that had brought him to this moment, a journey that began with silence, deepened through desire, and culminated in the absolute command of his own fate. Part 1: The forging of silence. The rats were the worst part of the dungeon beneath the Bargello. Not their squeaking or their bold scavenging, but the way they seemed to understand that Lorenzo was powerless to stop them from crawling over his body as he lay chained to the damp stone wall. For 3 weeks, he had been accused of embezzling funds from the guild treasury, a charge fabricated by Giacomo Salviati, who needed a scapegoat for his own theft. Lorenzo's protests of innocence had fallen on deaf ears, his lowly birth made him an easy target, and Salviati's connections made him untouchable. On the morning of what was to be his final day alive, Lorenzo experienced what he would later recognize as his first true awakening. As the guards prepared to drag him to the courtyard for execution, he realized that his frantic protestations, his emotional appeals, his desperate attempts to prove his innocence had all worked against him. Every word he had spoken had been used to tighten the noose around his neck. His honesty had been interpreted as guilt, his emotion as the hysteria of a cornered criminal. In that moment of crystalline clarity, as the iron shackles were unlocked from his wrists, Lorenzo made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would never again allow words to escape his lips without careful calculation of their effect. He would master the art of silence, not merely as the absence of speech, but as a strategic weapon more powerful than any sword. When they hauled him before the magistrate for his final hearing, something had changed in Lorenzo's demeanor. Gone was the desperate pleading, replaced by a calm, almost unsettling composure. When asked if he had any final words, he simply smiled, an expression so enigmatic that it gave his accusers pause. Instead of the expected confession or plea for mercy, Lorenzo spoke just 7 words, delivered with the precision of a master craftsman: "The truth has a way of emerging." The magistrate, a man named Bernardo who had seen hundreds of condemned men grovel and beg, was struck by Lorenzo's composure. There was something in the young man's eyes, not defiance, not resignation, but a quality that suggested hidden knowledge. Bernardo found himself postponing the execution for 24 hours, ostensibly to allow time for any new evidence to surface, but really because Lorenzo's silence had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. That night, as Lorenzo sat in his cell contemplating his narrow reprieve, a remarkable thing happened. A fellow prisoner, a pickpocket named Marco who had been observing the events with interest, approached him with information. Marco had been in the guild hall the night of the supposed theft and had witnessed Salviati removing the missing funds. Fear had kept him silent, but Lorenzo's dignity in the face of death had inspired him to speak. The revelation that followed vindicated Lorenzo and destroyed Salviati, but the real lesson was deeper than mere justice served. Lorenzo understood that his previous approach, emotional, verbose, desperate, had marked him as a victim. His silence, however, had created space for others to project their own thoughts and feelings onto him. The magistrate had seen wisdom where there was calculation, Marco had seen nobility where there was strategy. By saying less, Lorenzo had become more. Upon his release, Lorenzo did not celebrate or seek revenge. Instead, he spent months studying the dynamics of what had transpired. He observed how men in power responded to different types of communication, how silence could be more persuasive than the most eloquent speech, and how the strategic withholding of information could create an aura of mystery and competence that opened doors no amount of credentials could unlock. He began to practice silence as other men practice swordsmanship. He learned to listen not just to what was said, but to what remained unspoken. He discovered that most people were so uncomfortable with silence that they would fill it with increasingly revealing statements, often contradicting their own interests. He mastered the art of the meaningful pause, the strategic non-response, the eloquent gesture that conveyed more than paragraphs of explanation. Within a year of his near execution, Lorenzo had secured a position as an assistant to Francesco Guicciardini, one of Florence's most influential diplomats. He had obtained this position not through recommendations or family connections, but by demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to understand what others needed without being told. His silence had become his signature, and men of power began to seek his counsel precisely because he seemed to know the value of discretion. During his first diplomatic mission to Rome, Lorenzo observed how Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, conducted negotiations. The cardinal spoke rarely during formal sessions, allowing others to reveal their positions while keeping his own counsel. When he did speak, his words carried tremendous weight precisely because of their rarity. Lorenzo noticed how this strategic silence created an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that the cardinal could manipulate to his advantage. The cardinal's approach to silence was not passive waiting, but active listening combined with careful observation of body language, tone, and the spaces between words. He seemed to understand that every negotiation was really multiple conversations happening simultaneously, the spoken words, the unspoken implications, the emotional currents beneath the surface, and the strategic calculations each party was making. By remaining silent, he could monitor all these levels simultaneously while his opponents struggled to interpret his intentions. Lorenzo began to emulate and refine these techniques. He developed what he privately called the architecture of silence, a systematic approach to strategic communication that treated words as precious resources to be deployed with maximum effect. He learned to use silence to create psychological pressure, to force opponents into revealing positions they had intended to conceal, and to project an image of deep thoughtfulness that made others ascribe wisdom to his restraint. The transformation was remarkable. Men who had previously dismissed him as the blacksmith's son now sought his advice on matters of state. Women found his mysterious demeanor irresistibly attractive. Even his enemies began to speak of him with a grudging respect, uncertain whether his silence concealed profound wisdom or dangerous knowledge they had yet to discover. But Lorenzo understood that silence alone was insufficient. It was a foundation, not a complete structure. The second principle of his transformation would emerge from his growing awareness that beneath every human action lay the driving force of desire, and that the man who could harness this force, both in himself and others, would possess a power that could reshape the world around him. As he rose through the ranks of Florentine society, Lorenzo began to observe how desire operated in the corridors of power. He watched men destroy themselves pursuing inappropriate lovers, compromise their principles for fleeting advantages, and sacrifice long-term gains for immediate gratification. But he also observed how the wisest leaders seemed to channel desire into productive ends, using their understanding of human motivation to inspire loyalty, create alliances, and achieve objectives that seemed impossible through force alone. The lesson was becoming clear: silence provided the space to observe and understand, but desire provided the fuel for action and transformation. The man who could master both would find himself possessed of a terrible and magnificent power, the ability to shape not only his own destiny, but the destinies of all who came within his sphere of influence. Part 2, The Alchemy of Desire. The revelation came to Lorenzo on a humid evening in July, as he watched Cardinal Alessandro Farnese seduce both a Venetian ambassador's wife and the ambassador himself, though neither was aware of the dual manipulation taking place. The reception was being held in the gardens of the Palazzo Medici, ostensibly to celebrate the feast day of San Lorenzo, but really to provide a neutral ground for various Italian powers to gauge each other's intentions regarding the French threat. Lorenzo had been observing the cardinal throughout the evening, noting how the man seemed to understand the secret desires of everyone around him. With the ambassador's wife, Farnese played the role of the sophisticated older man who appreciated her intelligence as much as her beauty, a stark contrast to her husband's dismissive treatment. With the ambassador himself, Farnese positioned himself as the valuable ally who could provide access to papal influence and Roman gold. Each person left their conversation with the cardinal feeling that their deepest needs had been recognized and that Farnese was uniquely positioned to fulfill them. But Lorenzo's true education began when he realized that Farnese was using the same principle on himself. Earlier in the evening, the cardinal had approached Lorenzo with what seemed like casual conversation about his background and ambitions. Through seemingly innocent questions, Farnese had identified Lorenzo's core desire, the transformation from his humble origins into a figure of genuine influence and respect. Then, with surgical precision, the cardinal had planted the suggestion that such transformation required not just political skill, but understanding of the deeper forces that moved men, forces that the Church had been studying for centuries. The conversation had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it left Lorenzo with a burning curiosity about the cardinal's methods and a half-formed conviction that Farnese possessed knowledge that could accelerate his own rise to power. Only hours later, as he watched Farnese work the room like a master musician playing a complex instrument, did Lorenzo realize he had been masterfully manipulated. Far from feeling resentment, however, he felt a profound admiration for the technique and an urgent desire to understand its mechanics. That night, unable to sleep, Lorenzo began to systematically analyze every significant decision he had made since his release from prison. What he discovered disturbed and exhilarated him in equal measure. Every choice, every alliance, every calculated move had been driven by a desire he had never fully acknowledged, the transformation from victim to victor, from powerless to powerful, from dismissed to respected. This desire had been his secret strength, providing the energy and determination that had carried him through obstacles that would have defeated a weaker man. But desire, he realized, was a double-edged force. Uncontrolled, it led to the spectacular self-destruction he witnessed daily among Florence's elite. Men would betray longtime allies for temporary advantages, compromise crucial negotiations for sexual gratification, or abandon sound strategies to satisfy wounded pride. Desire unmastered was a fire that consumed its host. But, desire properly channeled, desire transformed into focused will and strategic patience, became the philosopher's stone that could transmute base circumstances into golden opportunities. Lorenzo began to study desire the way scholars studied classical texts, methodically, analytically, with careful attention to patterns and principles. He observed how different types of desire operated in different personalities. The merchant prince Francesco d'Adini was driven by an insatiable hunger for wealth that made him predictably manipulable through appeals to profit. The condottiere Bartolomeo di Alviano was motivated by an almost pathological need for military glory that made him willing to accept increasingly dangerous assignments for the promise of greater fame. The scholar Pico della Mirandola seemed driven by an intellectual pride that made him vulnerable to flattery about his erudition and unique insights. More importantly, Lorenzo began to map his own desires with ruthless honesty. Beneath his surface ambitions for political advancement, he discovered deeper currents, a need to prove his worth that stemmed from his humble origins, a desire for security rooted in his childhood poverty, and an almost artistic appreciation for the elegant exercise of power that went beyond mere ambition. Understanding these forces within himself allowed him to harness them rather than be driven by them unconsciously. The transformation began with what Lorenzo privately termed the Great Experiment. Instead of allowing his desires to emerge spontaneously and, then, struggle to satisfy them, he began to consciously cultivate specific desires that aligned with his strategic objectives. If he needed to develop a relationship with a particular noble family, he would spend time contemplating what benefits such an alliance could bring until he felt a genuine enthusiasm for the connection. If a task was necessary but unappealing, he would meditate on its potential consequences until he could find aspects that excited his imagination. This deliberate cultivation of desire proved remarkably effective. Tasks that had previously felt like drudgery became engaging challenges. Relationships that had been purely transactional developed emotional depth that made them more resilient and productive. Most importantly, Lorenzo found that his consciously directed enthusiasm was contagious. Others were drawn to work with him because they sensed his genuine engagement with their mutual projects. But the real breakthrough came when Lorenzo realized he could apply the same principles to others. Just as he had learned to cultivate specific desires within himself, he could identify and nurture particular desires in those around him. This was not simple manipulation, but a more sophisticated form of leadership that aligned others' motivations with collective objectives. He began with small experiments. When working with Francesco Guicciardini on a complex trade negotiation, Lorenzo noticed that his superior was driven by a desire to be seen as indispensable to Florence's diplomatic efforts. Rather than competing for credit, Lorenzo deliberately structured their collaboration to highlight Guicciardini's crucial role while ensuring that his own contributions were noted by the right observers. The result was not only a successful negotiation, but Guicciardini's strong advocacy for Lorenzo's advancement within the diplomatic corps. With Cardinal Farnese himself, Lorenzo employed a more subtle approach. Through careful conversation, he identified the cardinal's core desire, to be recognized not merely as a political operator, but as a sophisticated student of human nature whose insights transcended mere ecclesiastical concerns. Lorenzo began to engage Farnese in philosophical discussions about power, morality, and human motivation, conversations that fed the cardinal's self-image while providing Lorenzo with invaluable education in the arts of influence and persuasion. The technique that Lorenzo developed through these experiments was based on what he called desire alchemy, the transformation of base human motivations into higher purposes that served multiple interests simultaneously. Unlike crude manipulation, which eventually provoked resistance and resentment, desire alchemy created genuine satisfaction for all parties while advancing Lorenzo's strategic objectives. A perfect example of this approach occurred during the negotiations to renew Florence's banking privileges with the papal treasury. The papal treasurer, Cardinal Pucci, was known for his rigid adherence to financial orthodoxy and his suspicion of innovative banking practices that Florence wanted to implement. Traditional approaches had failed because they had tried to overcome Pucci's resistance through either logical argument or political pressure. Lorenzo recognized that beneath Pucci's conservative exterior lay a deep desire to be remembered as a reformer who had modernized church finances while maintaining fiscal responsibility. Instead of arguing against Pucci's caution, Lorenzo reframed Florence's proposals as careful innovations that would demonstrate the cardinal's wisdom in balancing progress with prudence. He suggested that Pucci's oversight of these new practices would create a model that other Italian states would seek to emulate, positioning the cardinal as the architect of a new era in church-state financial relations. The negotiation succeeded brilliantly, but, more importantly, it established Lorenzo's reputation as a diplomat who could achieve results where others failed. Word of his innovative approach reached influential figures throughout Italy, including Cesare Borgia, who invited Lorenzo to participate in several sensitive negotiations between the Papal States and various Italian powers. Working with Cesare Borgia provided Lorenzo with a masterclass in the practical application of desire alchemy on a grand scale. Borgia's approach to conquest was based not primarily on military superiority, but on his uncanny ability to understand what his opponents truly wanted and, then, position himself as the most reliable means of achieving those goals. Cities that should have resisted his advances often opened their gates willingly because Borgia had convinced their leaders that submission would bring them greater wealth, security, or status than continued independence. Lorenzo observed how Borgia would spend weeks before any campaign studying the personalities, relationships, and motivations of key figures in his target territories. He maintained networks of informants who reported not just on military preparations and political alliances, but on personal scandals, family dynamics, and individual ambitions. When Borgia finally moved, he was armed not just with soldiers and siege engines, but with precise knowledge of which desires to appeal to and which fears to exploit. The most instructive example Lorenzo witnessed was Borgia's acquisition of the fortress city of Imola. Rather than laying siege, Borgia spent 3 months cultivating the fortress commander's secret desire to establish his own independent territory. Through intermediaries, Borgia suggested that the commander's military skills and knowledge of the region's defenses made him ideally suited to govern a small principality under papal protection. By the time Borgia's army arrived outside Imola's walls, the commander had already decided that surrender would bring him greater rewards than resistance. But Lorenzo also observed the dangers of desire alchemy when practiced without genuine skill or understanding. Borgia's brother, Juan, attempted to employ similar techniques but lacked the patience and insight necessary for success. Juan's crude attempts at manipulation created enemies who eventually engineered his assassination, demonstrating that the power to shape others' desires carried corresponding risks for those who wielded it imprudently. These observations led Lorenzo to develop a crucial refinement in his approach: the principle of sustainable satisfaction. Unlike manipulation, which created temporary compliance followed by resentment, true desire alchemy required ensuring that those influenced by it achieved genuine satisfaction from their choices. This meant that Lorenzo's interventions had to create real value for all parties, not merely the illusion of benefit. This principle was tested during a complex dispute between Florence and Siena over water rights that had been poisoning relations between the two city-states for decades. Previous mediators had focused on legal precedents and economic calculations, but Lorenzo realized that the dispute had become a symbol of deeper rivalries and wounded pride on both sides. The Florentine negotiators were driven by a desire to demonstrate their city's dominance, while their Sienese counterparts needed to prove that their independence remained meaningful despite their smaller size and resources. Lorenzo's solution was to reframe the water rights agreement as the foundation for a larger partnership that would benefit both cities' trade relationships with other Italian powers. Instead of treating the dispute as a zero-sum competition, he transformed it into an opportunity for both sides to achieve objectives that went beyond the original disagreement. Florence gained the water access they needed, but within a framework that positioned Siena as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. Siena retained their dignity and gained access to Florentine financial resources for infrastructure improvements that would benefit both cities. The success of this negotiation established Lorenzo's reputation throughout Italy as a diplomatic innovator whose methods produced lasting results rather than temporary compromises. More importantly, it confirmed his understanding that desire properly harnessed was the key to creating sustainable influence and genuine leadership. But, as Lorenzo's power and reputation grew, he began to understand that mastery of silence and desire, while necessary, were not sufficient for the highest levels of achievement. The third principle of his transformation was beginning to emerge from his growing awareness that true sovereignty required not just the ability to influence others, but the capacity to remain immune to their influence in return. The man who would command his destiny must first become unconquerable, and this required a form of self-mastery that went beyond mere strategic thinking. Part 3, The Fortress of Self-Mastery. The attempt on Lorenzo's life came on a foggy December morning as he crossed the Ponte Vecchio on his way to a meeting with the Signoria. The assassin was a Sienese merchant whose family had lost their ancestral lands due to the water rights agreement Lorenzo had negotiated, an outcome the merchant blamed on Lorenzo's supposed favoritism toward Florence despite the negotiation's evident benefits to both sides. The knife thrust was expertly aimed and would have been fatal if Lorenzo had not developed what he called the practice of perpetual awareness, a state of heightened attention that allowed him to notice the merchant's approach and react quickly enough to deflect the blade. As Lorenzo stood over his would-be assassin, watching the man bleed into the muddy stones of the bridge, he experienced a moment of profound clarity about the nature of power and its inevitable consequences. Success in the political arena inevitably created enemies, and those enemies would always seek to destroy what they could not control or comprehend. The merchant's attack was not really about the water rights negotiation, it was about the deeper human tendency to blame external forces for personal failures and to seek the destruction of those who reminded them of their own limitations. This realization led Lorenzo to understand that his previous focus on mastering silence and desire, while crucial, had left him vulnerable to the chaotic forces of envy, resentment, and random malice that surrounded anyone who dared to rise above mediocrity. True security, and thus true freedom to pursue his larger objectives, required the development of what ancient philosophers had called autarky, complete self-sufficiency and independence from external circumstances. But Lorenzo's conception of autarky was more sophisticated than mere stoicism or withdrawal from worldly affairs. He sought to develop a form of self-mastery that would allow him to operate freely within the dangerous currents of political life while remaining fundamentally untouchable by its vicissitudes. This meant cultivating not just emotional resilience, but a systematic independence from the needs, opinions, and actions of others that typically constrained ambitious men. The first step in this process was what Lorenzo termed the inventory of dependencies. He spent several weeks cataloging every way in which his security, happiness, and effectiveness depended on external factors beyond his control. The list was longer and more disturbing than he had anticipated. His position depended on Francesco Guicciardini's continued favor. His income relied on the political stability of Florence. His safety required the competence and loyalty of guards who might be bribed or intimidated. His reputation rested on the continued goodwill of allies who might discover competing interests. Even his basic necessities, food, shelter, information, came through networks that could be disrupted by his enemies. Each dependency represented a potential vulnerability, a lever that others could use to influence or destroy him. The merchant's attack had been crude and easily thwarted, but a more sophisticated enemy could apply pressure through any of these vulnerabilities with devastating effect. Lorenzo realized that as long as he remained dependent on external circumstances for his essential needs, he could never achieve true freedom of action. The solution was not to eliminate all dependencies, such isolation would render him powerless, but to systematically reduce his reliance on any single source of support while developing internal resources that could substitute for external ones when necessary. This approach required careful analysis of which dependencies were truly essential and which merely reflected habit or convenience. Lorenzo began with his financial situation. Like most men of his station, he had become accustomed to a lifestyle that required steady income from his political activities. This dependency made him vulnerable to pressure from superiors and limited his ability to take principled stands that might jeopardize his position. Over the course of 2 years, Lorenzo quietly developed alternative income sources through careful investments in Florentine banking operations, trade partnerships with merchants in other Italian cities, and even a small but profitable import business that brought exotic goods from Constantinople. This financial diversification served multiple purposes beyond mere security. It provided Lorenzo with independent sources of information about economic and political developments throughout the Mediterranean world. It created opportunities to build relationships with influential figures outside Florence's political establishment. Most importantly, it gave him the confidence that came from knowing he could maintain his essential lifestyle even if his political career ended suddenly. But financial independence was only the beginning of Lorenzo's transformation. He recognized that psychological dependencies were often more constraining than material ones. Most men were slaves to their need for approval, recognition, and social status. They modified their behavior based on others' reactions, compromised their principles to maintain popularity, and made crucial decisions based on how they would be perceived rather than what outcomes they would produce. Lorenzo had observed this dynamic countless times in Florence's councils and courts. Talented men would abandon sound strategies because they feared being blamed for failure. Others would pursue obviously flawed policies because they promised immediate popularity. The most tragic cases were those who possessed genuine wisdom and ability but remained ineffective because they could not bear the thought of being disliked or misunderstood. Lorenzo noticed how even his private thoughts were often shaped by imagined conversations with others, how he would mentally rehearse explanations or justifications for his actions, seeking the approval of voices that existed only in his mind. Breaking free from this internal chatter required developing what he termed the sovereign mind, a state of consciousness focused entirely on objective reality and personal principles rather than social dynamics and interpersonal drama. The development of the sovereign mind was facilitated by Lorenzo's systematic study of those historical figures who had achieved genuine independence from external circumstances. He was particularly influenced by Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations revealed a man who had learned to find satisfaction in the proper execution of his duties regardless of their reception by others. But Lorenzo was also inspired by more recent examples like Francesco Sforza, who had risen from humble mercenary to Duke of Milan through a combination of military skill and psychological independence that allowed him to pursue long-term strategies despite constant criticism and opposition. Lorenzo's study of these exemplars revealed a crucial insight: true self-mastery was not a destination but a practice that required constant renewal and refinement. The tendency to seek external validation was so deeply ingrained in human psychology that it could never be permanently eliminated, only consciously countered through daily discipline and reflection. This understanding led Lorenzo to establish what became his most important daily practice: the evening examination. Each night, before sleep, he would review the day's events with particular attention to moments when he had acted from a desire for approval rather than from principle, when he had allowed others' emotions to influence his decisions, or when he had compromised his long-term objectives for short-term comfort. This practice was not self-flagellation but systematic training, designed to strengthen his ability to recognize and resist external pressures in real time. The effectiveness of this approach was tested during the crisis that erupted when Pope Julius II formed the League of Cambrai against Venice. Florence found itself in an impossible position. Joining the League meant breaking lucrative trade relationships with Venice, but remaining neutral risked papal anger and possible invasion. The Signoria was paralyzed by conflicting pressures and changing circumstances that seemed to offer no good options. Lorenzo's response demonstrated the power of his systematic self-mastery. While others were consumed by anxiety about making the right choice in an impossible situation, Lorenzo focused on identifying the course of action that best aligned with Florence's long-term interests and his own principles, regardless of its immediate popularity or risks. Through careful analysis uncolored by emotional pressure, he recognized that the League's apparent strength was actually a weakness. The alliance between France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy was based on temporarily aligned interests that would inevitably diverge once Venice was defeated. Based on this assessment, Lorenzo privately counseled delay and minimal compliance, enough cooperation to avoid immediate retaliation but insufficient commitment to prevent Florence from changing course when the alliance collapsed. This strategy was deeply unpopular with those who wanted decisive action in either direction, but Lorenzo's psychological independence from their approval allowed him to maintain his position despite intense pressure. The vindication of this approach came within 18 months, when the League of Cambrai collapsed exactly as Lorenzo had predicted. France and the Holy Roman Empire found themselves at war with each other, the Pope switched sides to balance against French power, and Venice recovered most of its lost territories. Florence, having avoided deep commitment to any side, emerged from the crisis with minimal damage and maximum flexibility for future maneuvering. But the most significant test of Lorenzo's self-mastery came from an unexpected source: success itself. As his reputation for wisdom and effectiveness spread throughout Italy, he found himself surrounded by admirers, supplicants, and potential allies who sought to attach themselves to his rising star. The temptation to enjoy this adulation, to make decisions based on maintaining his elevated status, was more subtle but potentially more corrupting than any external pressure he had previously faced. Lorenzo recognized that success could be the most dangerous enemy of self-mastery. The man who could resist the pressure of opponents might still be destroyed by the seductive whispers of supporters who encouraged him to see himself as indispensable, brilliant, or destined for greatness. History was littered with the wreckage of leaders who had achieved genuine accomplishments only to lose their way in the labyrinth of their own success. To guard against this trap, Lorenzo developed what he privately called the practice of essential humility. This was not false modesty or self-deprecation, but a systematic effort to maintain accurate perspective on his achievements and limitations. He reminded himself daily that his success depended heavily on circumstances beyond his control: the political instability that created opportunities for skilled negotiators, the accidents of birth and education that had equipped him with useful talents, and the support of mentors and allies who could have chosen to help others instead. This practice was supported by Lorenzo's careful study of failures, both his own small mistakes and the dramatic downfalls of others who had seemed unassailable at their peak. He maintained detailed notes on the specific errors that had destroyed seemingly successful leaders, using their examples as warnings against the particular forms of pride and overconfidence that accompanied different types of achievement. The effectiveness of this approach was demonstrated during Lorenzo's final great test: the arrival of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in Florence with his dangerous proposition. Farnese had come to offer Lorenzo a position as the papal legate to the French court, a role that would make him one of the most powerful diplomatic figures in Europe but would also place him at the center of the increasingly violent struggle between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The offer was precisely calibrated to appeal to Lorenzo's known ambitions and capabilities. It promised unprecedented influence, enormous wealth, and the opportunity to shape the destiny of nations. But Lorenzo's systematic self-mastery allowed him to see beyond the surface attractions to the hidden costs and risks. The position would make him dependent on papal favor for his security and effectiveness. It would place him in constant physical danger as he moved between hostile courts. Most importantly, it would require him to serve interests that might conflict with his own principles and long-term objectives. As Lorenzo prepared for his final meeting with Cardinal Farnese, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the dungeons of the Bargello to this moment of supreme choice. The three principles he had discovered and mastered: silence as strategic weapon, desire as transformative force, and self-mastery as ultimate defense had given him something rarer and more valuable than wealth or conventional power: genuine freedom to choose his own path based on his own values. The man who destroyed his weak self, the desperate, emotional, dependent creature he had once been, could never be destroyed by others because he had eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that enemies typically exploited. He had become like a fortress built on solid rock, impregnable not because of high walls and strong gates, but because there was nothing within it that could be used against itself. Standing at his window as the sun reached its zenith over Florence, Lorenzo smiled as he prepared to descend to the reception hall. Cardinal Farnese was undoubtedly expecting to encounter a man driven by ambition and vulnerable to flattery. Instead, he would meet someone far more dangerous, a man who had learned to want only what served his highest purposes, who could see through any deception because he had first learned to see through his own self-deceptions, and who possessed the rarest form of power, the ability to say no to anything that would compromise his essential freedom. The negotiation that followed would be remembered by those who witnessed it as a masterclass in principled strength. Farnese, for all his skill and preparation, found himself outmaneuvered by an opponent who could not be pressured, flattered, or threatened because he had systematically eliminated every external dependency that typically constrained ambitious men. Lorenzo declined the papal position with such grace and strategic insight that even Farnese left Florence with increased respect for the man who had refused his offer. Years later, as Lorenzo governed his own small but prosperous territory with wisdom and justice, he would often reflect on the strange alchemy by which weakness had been transformed into strength, dependency into freedom, and the desperate need for external validation into the serene confidence that came from self-mastery. The principles he had discovered in his youth, the strategic power of silence, the transformative force of properly channeled desire, and the unassailable strength of genuine independence, had proven themselves not just as tools for survival in a dangerous world, but as the foundation for a life of meaning, effectiveness, and genuine satisfaction. The man who had once trembled in chains, awaiting execution for crimes he had not committed, had become someone who could stand before the most powerful figures of his age as an equal. Not because he had acquired wealth or titles, but because he had achieved something far rarer: complete sovereignty over himself. In destroying his weak self, he had become truly indestructible, not because no one could harm him, but because he no longer possessed the internal vulnerabilities that made such harm possible. This was the ultimate teaching that Lorenzo would pass on to those few students worthy of receiving it: that true power lay not in the ability to control others, but in the achievement of perfect self-command. The man who mastered silence would never be betrayed by his words. The man who harnessed desire would never be enslaved by his appetites. And the man who achieved genuine independence would never be destroyed by the actions of others, because he had eliminated every weakness within himself that his enemies could exploit. In the end, Lorenzo had discovered what the greatest leaders throughout history had always known but rarely articulated: that the ultimate victory was not the conquest of external territories or the accumulation of worldly goods, but the transformation of oneself from victim of circumstances into master of destiny. This transformation was available to anyone willing to pay its price: the complete destruction of their weak, dependent, emotionally driven former self and its replacement with something infinitely stronger, a human being who had learned to derive strength, guidance, and satisfaction from sources that could never be taken away.